I'm going to call the State Government Finance Committee to order. Members, in your packet, you have the minutes from February 22nd. If Representative Flanagan wants to move the minutes. Representative Flanagan moves the minutes for February 22nd. All those in favor of the minutes, please say aye. Those opposed, the minutes are adopted. Folks, we have a couple of housekeeping items here to take care of first off. One, we have a new committee legislative assistant. I shouldn't say new because she's been in many. How many committees have you been in, Shirley?
6.
She's been in more committees than I have, I think. So we welcome Shirley Cotterick. She's our new committee legislative assistant, and so happy to have her. She has a wealth of knowledge and will be very useful to our committee. So if you ever have issues, Shirley is your go-to person to go to. And then also, it looks like we have a new page with us today as well. And if you can just shout out your name and what college you went to, or what's your background?
My name is Becca, and prior to this, I worked in community mental health.
Okay, very good. And will you be with us for a while? Or is this your assignment?
This is my assignment.
All right. We're happy to have you, Becca. Thank you for being part of our committee. So with that, members, we have, once again, Legislative Auditor Jim Nobles with us. And I assume you have some phone-in friends, too? Excellent. Well, welcome to the committee. If you can please state your name for the record and who you represent. We're going to be reviewing your special review of the state auditor's county audits. Mr.
Thank you, Madam
Nobles.
Chair, members of the committee. Jim Nobles, Legislative Auditor. And with me at the table is Lori Lyson, who is an audit director in the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and she is also our Director of Quality Control. And she was the manager of the audit review that we're going to talk about today. I would like to start just very briefly giving you a bit of background. I know all of you on this committee have dealt a lot with audits of counties. It's been a topic of conversation before this committee quite a bit. But let me just, again, give you a little bit of refresher. Back in 1973, and I'm not going to cover all the years from 73 to the current, but back in 1973, the legislature decided that the audit functions would be put in the state auditor's office and the legislative auditor's office. Now, you might say, well, then who was doing it before then? Well, it was an officer in the executive branch called the public examiner. And so in 1973, the legislature divided the jurisdiction of the public examiner and gave the state auditor, for the first time, jurisdiction to audit local units of government, including counties, and gave the legislative auditor jurisdiction to audit state government. And that's pretty much the jurisdiction to this day. Now, both of the offices were given very large responsibilities and very broad jurisdictions. We have responsibility for everything in the executive branch, the judicial branch, a lot of nonprofit organizations. And the state auditor has jurisdiction for literally hundreds of units of local government. And so over the decades, both the state auditor and the legislative auditor have used CPA firms to do a good deal of the work, the audit work, at both the state and local level. In fact, it's my understanding that the state auditor's office has never itself audited Hennepin County, the largest county in the state of Minnesota. That's been done for decades by a CPA firm. Likewise, we have jurisdiction over the University of Minnesota, MnSCU, many other units of government, and we do not audit their financial statements because we do not think that is the most strategic and effective use of our resources. We retain jurisdiction to go back in and do additional work, but the financial statements we think can be done, and in many cases should be done, by CPA firms. As Ms. Lyson is going to tell you, we all, both in the public and private sector, work under the same standards, the same rules, and they apply to every financial statement audit we do and all of the other audits that we do as well. Now, I do think there are kinds of audits that ought to be done by the legislative auditor or the state auditor. But it has certainly been my position that, again, financial statement audits can be done by the CPA firms. Now, we still retain, and we can talk to you about this someday, responsibility to audit the state's financial statements. And just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about, these are the financial statements of the state. It's something you ought to spend a lot of time with reading, all these tables and charts. Now, our part in this, and any other audit firm, is about 3 pages. And it's called an audit opinion. And I would also invite you to try reading that sometime. It's a little bit like reading your insurance policy. It's very technical. And so again, for us, the value is in some of the evaluations that we do of state programs, some of the control compliance audits that we do, and the special reviews. And so over the years, we have decided not to audit the financial statements of organizations like the State Fair, MnSCU, and a variety of other organizations, and leave that to CPA firms. And if we need to, we will go back in and do other work. So given that as a backdrop, in 2015, you, as I'm sure you recall, enacted legislation that allowed counties to choose whether or not to be audited by a CPA firm or the state auditor. And again, that was in the backdrop that the state auditor had previously decided that many counties should and could be audited by a CPA firm. So you pretty much incorporated that into a law in 2015. And as you know, the state auditor objected and filed a lawsuit in 2016 in February in Ramsey County, asking the court to declare what you did unconstitutional. The Ramsey County Court disagreed and said that the legislature was within its authority, that you did not abolish a core function of the state auditor, that you had given that function to the state auditor previously, and you could and had over the years modified it. And so the state auditor lost at the district court level, then appealed to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals upheld the district court. And that case is now before the Minnesota Supreme Court, and I anticipate that a decision will be forthcoming sometime later in the spring or in the summer. So along the way, with all of the litigation about these various things, a few other things have happened. One, and it's one of the things that brings us here today, in March 2017, the state auditor issued a report that examined a number of the audits that were done by CPA firms of counties and said that some of those audits were deficient. And so I think to some degree, in response to that, you asked the Office of the Legislative Auditor to examine the county audits done by the state auditor, by the same standards that the state auditor applied to the CPA firms. And that is this report, which we issued last month, and we're here to talk to you about today. And Lori Lyson was the manager of that, and she's going to present it to you unless you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor. We have a question from Representative Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your statement, you said that the legislature granted counties the option. My understanding is that there were a large portion of counties that already had that option before the 2015 legislature allowed the rest of the counties that same option. Can you clarify for us?
Yes,
Nobles?
Mr. Chair, representatives, that's correct. The state auditor had previously given that option to a number of counties. And as I said, the state auditor had not, through that office, audited the largest county, Hennepin County, but many others as well. Those audits had been done by the CPA firms that those counties selected. I do need to say, though, that you did not take away fully all of the state auditor's jurisdiction over the counties. You said that the counties can choose a CPA firm, but if the state auditor finds any deficiency or just wants to exercise authority to go back in and look at some other issues that were not covered in the CPA audit, that the state auditor retained that jurisdiction. And I think that's one of the reasons why the district court and the Court of Appeals said that you did not take away a core function of the state auditor's office. You left the state auditor with a considerable amount of authority, even though in 2015 you gave the option of choosing a CPA firm to all of the counties.
Representative Quam?
Thank you, and I hope the members understand that clarification and what it totally entails. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Ms. Leeson, I believe. Welcome to the committee, and state your name and for the committee here.
Mr. Chair and committee members, my name is Lori Lyson. I'm an audit director at the Office of the Legislative Auditor in the Financial Audit Division. And I'm going to walk you through kind of the audit that we performed at the Office of the State Auditor. So as required by the 2017 law, we were to assess the adequacy of county audits performed by the state auditor in calendar year 2016. Our objectives of this review was to first and foremost address that law in assessing that adequacy of those audits. In addition to that, we also wanted to take a look at that March 2017 report that we just referred to and understand how the state auditor reached those findings and how the CPA firms responded to those findings. The work that we performed on assessing the adequacy based on the law was to take a look at both the desk and work paper reviews that are performed by the state auditor. Those include standard checklists that are created both from standards and from the Office of the state auditor. Those checklists were supplied by the state auditor for us. The desk reviews were completed at our office, and they essentially took a look at the financial statements and whether or not those complied with standards. And the work paper review actually delved deeper, and that we went on site to the state auditor's office, and we went ahead and looked at the audits that were performed both for the financial statements and also for the single audit, which is the federal money being spent by counties. In that review, we delved deep in looking at the type of planning that occurred and the tests that were performed and whether or not those were adequate. And then we took a look, after we assessed that adequacy, we also, like I mentioned before, we wanted to address the findings that were reported in the March 2017 report. And in there, to address that, we spoke to not only the managers at the state auditor's office, but we also spoke to some of the CPA firms to gain an understanding of how they address those findings. We also reviewed documentation obtained from the state auditor and from those CPA firms that we spoke to. In doing our audit, we use, as Legislative Auditor Nobles mentioned, we use the auditing standards. So this is the generally accepted auditing standards that we refer to, and we also use specifically to the government. There's government auditing standards also that we used. We believe that even though we consider this a review and maybe not specifically an audit, we still want to use a best practice in looking at auditing standards. And we also expected the state auditor to use those same auditing standards as a best practice, even if the office did not determine this to be a specific, determine this to be an audit. So in conclusion, in assessing the law and understanding the adequacy of the work that was performed by the state auditor, we actually concluded that they performed adequate audits. They went beyond, what we found is that they definitely they addressed them. There was some professional judgment that was used, and we understood that there's professional judgment that's used, and maybe not in every instance we always agreed to the testing that was performed or the conclusions that they came to, but we understand that professional judgment is used and that standards are at times subjective, and we were okay with that. However, in addressing the findings that were reported in the March 2017 report, we did find some issues. The Office of the State Auditor found over 130 findings when reviewing those 8 counties. So I'm just going to back up for a second. They performed the desk audit on 26 counties, but they performed the work paper review on 8 counties. And that is where the findings in that March 2017 report are stemming from, is that work paper review. And as I mentioned before, that's when you're really delving down deep into the audit work that was performed. And so that's where their findings were coming from. And of those 130 findings, actually over 130 findings, we felt that their support of those findings was not sufficient. In addition, we also felt that the state auditor's office did not treat the firms with standard due process and professional courtesy that is practiced in the audit industry. Specifically, we felt that they did not always consider the responses from the CPA firms. When we spoke to firms, oftentimes the firms, actually in all the firms that we spoke to, they did not agree with many of the findings, and they were not given an opportunity to respond to the findings in the report. We definitely mentioned in the report that they were able to respond to the findings to the state auditor, but not to the report. We also mentioned that they did not give sufficient notice of the report. In all the firms that we spoke to, they said that they were given notice the day before the report was released or the same day that the report was released. And actually, they all were under they were under the impression that this was just a routine review. They had no idea that there was going to be a published report. And finally, the concerns raised in the report, we felt may subject them to additional scrutiny, and that we felt that by not allowing them to respond, it was unfair to not allow them to respond and to be under that scrutiny by others. So just backing up to the auditing standards that we again use and that we felt that the state auditor should also use as a best practice, that when you follow those standards in planning your audit, in obtaining sufficient and appropriate evidence, in preparing audit documentation for your findings, and for reporting, you're coming down to obtaining reasonable assurance that evidence is sufficient and appropriate to support the auditor's findings and conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lyson. I have a question for you. Could you hold up that book again? Now, the big, thick one, that is the generally accepted accounting principles book that every CPA firm has to follow?
Mr. Chair and committee members, it's actually the generally accepted auditing standards.
Auditing standards.
Yes, it is what is used mainly for financial statements and compliance work. It's a best practice. So in our review of the state auditor, we didn't term that as an audit per se. We call it a special review, but we still look at these auditing standards as a best practice of how we want to approach our audit and how we want to ensure that the auditee is giving the fair opportunity to review the draft report before releasing it. And even before we do the draft report, we want to have a conversation with the auditee so they have an opportunity to give us any additional information that we may be missing or didn't have the opportunity to review in our audit work.
Okay, thank you. Very good testimony. I believe Representative Green has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Lyson, I only have one question for you, and hopefully you can clarify it. On page 5, where it says that the report raised concerns with other entities which may be subject to the firm's to additional scrutiny. Can you clarify this, which firms? And the reason I bring it up is because I'm under the impression, or I've had some information that says that the state auditor actually contacted federal agencies and advised them to treat these CPA firms with scrutiny. And so is that what you're talking about here, or is there other stuff as well?
Ms. Lyson.
Mr. Chair, committee members, in our report, we do state that we are trying to keep the confidentiality of the CPA firms. Not all CPA firms chose to discuss their audits with us, and so we wanted to respect that. That statement is just talking specifically about, I think I can speak in general, that it puts them under scrutiny for business, per se. Like if they are looking for, financial, the CPA firms, right? Some of these are national and international firms, right? And so there's that scrutiny for anyone that they might want to audit, and they're going in and giving their proposal and a bid. And if they have some type of audit that's out there that's published saying that they aren't doing a good job, that they have deficient audit work, that's not helping. That's putting them under scrutiny. And we're also saying too that it could be from authoritative bodies also. Maybe there's authoritative bodies out there that seeing these results and seeing that firms are being deficient would also scrutinize them further. So we spoke for a very general sense and nothing specific with the CPA firms that they told us.
Mr. Chairman, I just expand a little.
Mr. Nobles? Yes, sir.
Audit firms and the state auditor and the legislative auditor's office, all audit offices, public or private, do work under these very strict standards. And private CPA firms are licensed by the state. And individuals are licensed by the state. Ms. Lyson is licensed as a CPA, or as most of the auditors in the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And so all of us work under high expectations. And there can be, as Ms. Lyson said, real serious problems if you don't meet those expectations. I mean, if you were to read in a report that the Office of the Legislative Auditor was deficient in our work, that would really hurt our credibility with you. And therefore, as Ms. Lyson said, even when we're not conducting a financial audit, where we are absolutely required to follow this, we still do. And I would point to the report you have in front of you. This was a special review. We were not subject to these, but we followed them. In other words, we gave the state auditor every opportunity to review our findings, to submit a letter in the back of the report. I will be before you again tomorrow with a special review that I've been working on that has to do with the Historical Society and the State Historic Preservation Office. Again, that review is not subject to this, but I followed it. I have been conversing with the Historical Society about the draft since February 2nd. And I have interacted with them and obtained additional evidence, suggestions and comments that I've taken very seriously. And they are on full notice, far in advance, that that report is going to be released tomorrow, and a letter from the Historical Society will be enclosed. So again, I think our point is that whether you're doing a financial audit, a special review, an evaluation, you're still a professional called an auditor who needs to follow best practices.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. At this point, is there anyone from the State Auditor's Office, we're talking about some of these issues, is there anyone from the State Auditor's Office here that would like to testify before the committee? Do we have anybody in the audience? All right, ma'am, would you please come forward and state your name and position at the Auditor's Office?
I'm not with the state auditor.
Oh, okay, let's wait then for public testimony. Thank you so much for showing up. Is there anyone here from the Auditor's Office? Really? No one? All right, then we will continue. I'm relatively surprised. Representative Pugh, I believe you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Lyson, for your presentation and your great work. Greatly appreciate your being here. So my first question is with regard to the over 130 findings, and I'm wondering, it sounds like most of which were, you remarked there was insufficient support, and that most of which were challenged. I'm just wondering if you could provide some examples of those findings.
Ms. Leeson.
Mr. Chair, committee members, again, as I had mentioned before, for the confidentiality of the CPA firms, we did not provide specific examples purposely because it would point directly to the CPA firms that we spoke to. Yes, but I can say that in reviewing the findings, in general, again, when you go back to these auditing standards, they talk about findings and how you need to report those findings and what needs to be involved in a finding to make it a finding. And what we saw is, sure, they had documented what they saw, and we saw that that is what they then went ahead and conveyed to these CPA firms. However, the part that, one of the issues that we saw is what felt like it was missing was that conversation between them. And if the CPA firm is saying, we don't agree with this, or we have a work paper to show you that would go along with this finding, that would show you that it's actually resolved, or this is our professional judgment that we used, we didn't see how that was resolved or how they actually still came to the decision to keep that as an audit finding. So typically, when you're reporting findings and you're documenting them, you're doing it through the whole process, and you're saying not only from the beginning, here's the finding that I identified, but then you go all the way through the end. This is a conversation I had with the auditee. This is what they're saying. Despite that, we still feel like this is a finding, or no, we actually do agree with them, right? So it can go either way, like maybe we're agreeing with them, maybe we're not agreeing with them, but we're going to document that understanding of why we still came to that conclusion. So I know that's general, but hopefully that helps somewhat.
Thank you.
Yes,
Representative
thank you,
Pugh, I
Mr.
believe you have a
Chair.
follow-up. Yeah.
And that, yes, that was very, very helpful, because it brings me to my bigger concern, that being the lack of due process that was afforded these firms. And it's very concerning to me to learn, to hear that they were given a one-day notice, or even same day, to kind of course correct this, or, you know, make right, and that they weren't given an opportunity to protect their integrity and their credibility. So I'm really concerned about that. If I understand this right, you know, here are this report that was generated with all of these findings, but there wasn't an opportunity presented for the record to maintain to allow them the opportunity to maintain their reputation in the industry. So I'm just wondering if anyone has a comment about that, Mr. Nobles.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Nobles.
Representative Pugh, I think it might be helpful for you to understand that we too, as an office, are subject to an outside review. It's called a peer review. And we have to have that periodically. And the way that works is the National State Auditors Association chooses a group of senior auditors from other states. And usually there's 5 of them. And they come into our office, and they're in a conference room for typically a week. And they are doing what the state auditor did with these CPA firms. They're looking through our work papers to determine whether or not there is adequate evidence and documentation to support our findings. And as Ms. Lyson just said, it's not just that people are going through a box of papers or going through an electronic work paper system, which most audit offices now have. They are in our office interacting with us for 5 or 6 days. And they will have one of our reports in front of them, and they'll have a finding, and they'll say, okay, we need to go to your work papers and find the evidence to support that. And in our case, they'll have to go through a fairly complicated electronic work paper system, and we try to keep it very well organized so all the information is there and they can find it. But every once in a while, they may not know exactly where that document is, and so they will say, do you have documentation for this finding? We can't find it in your electronic system. And we will be there interacting with them almost throughout the day, saying, yes, it's here it is. And again, they may say, well, there is judgment. Yeah, we see that. Do you have anything else? And the conversation continues. And then they will draft up their findings. They will present them to us. We will have some time to respond. That's the way peer review works. It's an ongoing interaction among professionals. And that's why we said in this particular case that produced this report, That did not happen.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Representative Vogel, you're next up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To either of the testifiers, and I don't want to, I recognize that you're not giving legal opinions, but if you could just talk a little bit about the significance of the opinion. And I guess having looked at a lot of audits myself, the first thing I look for is the opinion. The statements and everything in back of it are fine, but if you don't have a clean opinion, it really doesn't matter what's coming next. So, and then the legal consequences maybe of these firms, not necessarily criminal, but at least civil, of what they have on the hook if indeed they're not following the procedures that are outlined in that book.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Vogel. I really appreciate that question because even though it's 3 pages in this financial statement of the state of Minnesota, as you just said, it's 3 very important pages. And one of the first things the credit rating agencies will look for in giving the state of Minnesota a credit rating is this opinion. They'll look at other things, but they want to know whether or not this document, before they sit down and read it and digest it, that the auditor has said, you can trust these numbers, that these numbers are presented to you according to generally accepted accounting principles. That's what this is all about. So that the people that need to know, for a variety of reasons, whether you're a citizen, a banker, a credit rating agency, that when one of these reports is issued, that you can trust these numbers, that they're prepared according to generally accepted accounting principles. And rather than requiring every credit rating agency or every citizen to go through these, you rely on the auditor's opinion to tell you. And so even though I regret to tell you, yes, it's pretty technical, and I'm sure you've read a lot of them, and you probably understand them, it's a very important part of a financial statement. The state's credit rating, the county's credit rating agents, credit rating, could be diminished by a negative audit opinion. Now, to your other point, if a credit rating agency gives a credit rating on a set of financial statements that gives a clean opinion, and then somebody comes along and says, but the auditor's work was deficient, that again puts a cloud over the financial statements and over the county or the state, and certainly over the CPA firm. And there could be legal liabilities attached to that. There have been audit firms that have been sued by people who held credit instruments based on an audit opinion in a set of financial statements. So it's a serious business. And reputations, licenses can be held in the balance of whether or not you have done sufficient work and you've given an opinion that is supported by the facts.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles, and I'd just like to say I'm very pleased that we have you around here in your office to really delve into this because this is a very, very important issue. I believe Chair Anderson, or no, Representative Vogel is next.
Just a follow-up, Mr. Chair. And that's my feeling as well. And these firms that were doing these audits, many of them are large firms with a lot of financial resource on the line. So my point is that what the work they did, they obviously must have felt comfortable or they wouldn't have pledged their assets in back of their name. But going a little farther than on page 6, it appears to me that when the review was done by the state auditor office, that there might have been different criteria used than what was in that book. In other words, personal knowledge of things going on. I'm wondering if that was one of the main reasons for the deviation between the state auditor's office saying this is an okay audit and them applying maybe different standards than the accounting industry may have applied because of personal experiences or things that they saw going on. So what I was looking at is that last paragraph on page 6, wondering if I'm interpreting that right, in that you follow the rules in the book, which allow you to put your name on a clean audit opinion, but then if somebody comes back in back of you and says, oh, by the way, this also applies, is that fair to the accounting firm?
Ms. Lyson, are you going to take that one?
Mr. Chair, committee members, so it's not that the state auditor's office used other standards, but if you're solely looking at the desk and work paper review checklist that the office uses, again, the desk review, none of the findings came from that. It came from the work paper review. And when we were performing our work paper review of their county, the audit work that they performed on the counties, we were wondering how they got from those checklists to some of the findings that they had in their March 2017 report. And what we were told is that they went beyond those checklists and used their knowledge and history of these audits to kind of delve deeper into different areas. And again, if we kind of go back to what the CPA firms, their understanding of what was occurring, they were thinking this was just a normal, desk review and work paper review. They weren't expecting anything beyond that. They weren't expecting a public report. And so again, there was no different standards that were used. It was just that they went beyond those checklists and definitely used their knowledge to look in areas. So for instance, maybe one of the reviewers saw something that they kind of questioned, and then what we were told is they went ahead and talked to all the reviewers and said, take a look at this, at those CPA firms, and see if they were doing this too, based, again, on their knowledge and history with them, if that helps.
Representative Vogel,
And just
follow-up?
just one short follow-up. So that goes along with the comment then that if there would have been the courtesy of an exchange of ideas after this, before the report was released to the public, that's where it would have been helpful to get a more accurate report, because then those differences could have been taken care of.
Ms. Lyson.
Mr. Chair, committee members, yes, that is accurate.
Thank you.
All right, I believe Chair Anderson has a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Nobles and Ms. License. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate the work that you guys have done in giving a review of this. I think I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of what Representative Vogel talked about in the fact that the state auditor's report, with that being out there, are you going to see that bond rating agencies will take into consideration now your report, or are they going to be limited in just looking at the state auditor's report in their judgment of these firms? And then what kind of impact does that specifically have on these counties when it comes to what their bond rating is? And if you could talk a little bit more about the tax implications that has for residents of those counties. If you have a lower bond rating, you pay more for your capital projects. Can you talk a little bit more in detail on that? And what can we expect of what kind of impact this will have for these counties?
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Nobles.
and Madam Chair, I honestly don't know. It would be some speculation, but I can only say that it is not good for the counties or the audit firms that did the work to have this report out there. My understanding is that in some cases, the state auditor has decided to go back and do another audit. And in one case that I am aware of, the state auditor has told the county that the state auditor will do the next audit because of the deficiencies that the state auditor said occurred here. How will credit rating agencies take this report into consideration? Again, I think that if they are fully attuned to everything that's going on, and I have no idea, no way of knowing how much they're following these issues, they may be aware of the fact that there could be other factors at work in Minnesota that would create a report like this. They may, for example, be aware of the legislation and the litigation, and that there is a good deal of conflict in Minnesota over, let's say, between the state auditor's office and the CPA firms that have done some of this work. I might say before this report was issued, many of these firms had done these county audits many times and had never been called out by the state auditor or, to my knowledge, anybody else.
And to that point, Mr. Noble?
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has the state auditor's office ever done this kind of work paper review of this kind of nature? Has it ever been done ever in this manner?
Mr. Nobles.
Madam Chair, and I'll let Ms. Lyson talk about this too. I mean, the state auditor throughout the existence of that office, and even continuing to this time, even after the 2015 legislation, can go in and do reviews of the audit work of CPA firms. But never, to my knowledge, has a report like this been issued. I mean, typically, this would be something that would be communicated probably individually to the audit firm, as it would be in a peer review, where you would sit down and go over issues, recommendations for improvement in documentation or risk assessment or planning or whatever it is. And frankly, sometimes people from the outside can come in and say, you know, I think you ought to do a better job on this. Tell an audit firm that. Tell us that. And the sky wouldn't fall necessarily. We would say, you know, we'll do better in that particular area. But what wouldn't happen is this kind of report. I mean, this is what's unusual, is this kind of report. But Lori, maybe you want to
Ms. Lyson, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Mr. Chair, committee members, it is my understanding also that there has never been a report like this issued. But if we look to the desk and work paper reviews that have been performed, the desk reviews, from my understanding, are done annually. That is something that the CPA firms are familiar with. They know that those desk reviews are occurring. The work paper reviews aren't necessarily done annually. Again, this is from my understanding, but that at any time, those CPA firms are subject to that type of review. And I know that there has been a firm that has been subjected to the work paper review. And as a result of that, counties have been pulled back to the state auditor, and that work has been done in the subsequent years by the state auditor, which I did put that in one of the footnotes on page 3 in footnote 15, where I talk about the price differences. That is as a result of a work paper review. But again, there has never been, in my knowledge, a work paper review or a desk review that has been published in a report.
Thank you. Chair Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Layson or Mr. Nobles, too. We've had a lot of the reports from the OLA office, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and typically in reading through all of those reports, whether it's pertaining to this committee or to other subject matters, you typically have the language of, we receive the full cooperation of the subject of the audit while performing this audit. I did notice that that was not present in this report. Can you comment as to why? Was it just an omission, or is there other factors at play?
Ms. Lyson, you want to field that one?
Sure. Mr. Chair, committee members, it was excluded from our report, and kind of at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about how we approached the law, and we did an assessment of the adequacy of those county audits performed by the state auditor. And we did, in that aspect, receive full cooperation from the Office of the State Auditor. However, when it came to that second objective in addressing the findings that were in that March 2017 report, we did not initially receive full cooperation. And at times, I would even broach it as a scope limitation. But using our authority, in the end, we were able to obtain the information necessary from the Office of the State Auditor.
Chair Anderson?
Well, thank you, Ms. Layson. That's disappointing to hear, in particular because as the legislative auditor, you're tasked with getting answers for the legislature. And, you know, I'm also disappointed in the fact that the state auditor does not have a representative here today, but I want members to know if they have any questions on this issue, we will be submitting a letter to the state auditor's office, and hopefully we'll get a response to any of the questions that we have here today that your staff will not are not able to answer. But do appreciate you coming in today. Oh, and well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Any closing comments, Mr. Knowles?
Mr. Chairman, just to thank this committee again for your attention to our work and I will be back tomorrow.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your exquisite testimony here. Next on the list, we have Gino Fragnato. Sorry, Gino. The Legislative Relations Director from the Minnesota Society of CPAs. Fragnito. There we are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Gino Fragnito, the Government Relations Director at the Minnesota Society of Certified Public Accountants, and thank you for hearing this report today and the special review of the State Auditor's March 2017 review of county audits. We appreciate the work that the Legislative Auditor's Office has put into this, and the findings are consistent with what the CPA firms experienced in the conversations I had with them through this whole process. They definitely were not afforded due process or the opportunity to provide clarity or additional documentation when the Office of the State Auditor had questions or believed something was not fully documented. It's no secret that the State Auditor was unhappy with the 2015 legislative change allowing counties the option to choose a CPA firm to conduct their annual audit. And it's very unfortunate that these firms, their employees, and their clients were subjected to a report that seemed to have a predetermined outcome before the process began. As we stated in our response to the Office of the State Auditor, professional judgment is a critical component of performing an audit, and there are many situations where professional judgment is required because issues have not been addressed in the professional standards. During a review of these audits, disagreements can occur, and they need to be worked out. CPA firms were not afforded that opportunity. A clear process for resolving these differences is a critical component in understanding how the reviewee performed the audits and what the reviewer expects to see when looking through the financial statements. We can all agree that quality is the core to the accounting profession, and both CPAs and the State Auditor's Office strive to protect the public interest. We also agree with the Legislative Auditor's findings and what they stated earlier, that the process developed did not and failed to follow best practices, and including things like a defined, transparent process for review, including distribution of initial findings, ongoing dialogue between the reviewer and the reviewee to agree upon facts and answer any follow-up questions that might have arose. A presentation of the initial findings with an adequate opportunity for the reviewees to respond, and a release of the final findings with comments by the party being reviewed. The process I just described is common practice in reviews around the country. Two examples include federal agency reviews that follow the quality standards for inspection and evaluation developed by the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, and also with the Virginia State Auditor's Office of Public Accounts, their document for specifications for audits related to counties, cities, and towns. Each of those documents spells out specifically what the expectations are, what the CPA firms can expect, and what the reviewer will be looking for. The decision of the State Auditor's Office to publish these findings before allowing adequate opportunity to the firms to respond without a due process to address differences of professional judgment or consideration of supporting data provided to the CPA firms damaged the firms, provided no recourse, and calls into question the objectivity of the March 17 report. These firms are facing national reputational damage and additional expense as a result of this report. And these firms and other firms in Minnesota are questioning whether it's really worth it to do this type of work in Minnesota, if this is the type of treatment they're going to receive from the state of Minnesota. We believe CPAs and the Office of the State Auditor both play an important role in ensuring stable and well-performing governments. CPAs take the findings seriously and certainly use the information to work and continuously improve their process. Changing regulations, evolving standards, and the complex structure of government units require that we all work together in order to provide the best end product. Effectively working together means that there are clear, transparent, and fair processes. CPA firms should be afforded due process to address differences of any professional judgment question. Without these elements, reports such as the one reviewed by the Office of the Legislative Auditor are neither objective or accurate and result in needless damage to the reputation of CPAs and the CPA firms. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fragnito. I have one quick question. I'm sure you've been around a while and things. Have you ever seen anything like this happen in the past?
I have not seen a report such as this ever.
Ever?
Not me personally. I can't
you.
say that one doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of one.
Thank you very much. We have Representative Vogel that has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the testifier. As I listen to this, and my concern is the ongoing thought, or whatever, the reputation of our accounting profession here in Minnesota relative to what's been done in this report, and just wondering if there's anything that can be done at this point that would help in that, because I concur with you that a rating agency is going to look at everything out there. And unfortunately, what this does is taint those opinions, and therefore, it may or may not come into to play on it. But if it does, we've got counties that could see their credit ratings significantly changed, which is going to increase their cost of borrowing. Plus, if we can't find private accounting firms that are willing to come into this state because they're afraid of what appears to me to be retaliation, we've got major problems. So the question is there anything at this point from your professional standpoint that you see could be done by the legislature to help in saying that this really isn't what it looks like?
Mr. Fregnito.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Vogel. We're in the process of having some ongoing conversations to see if there is something. I don't have an answer for the question today, but it is something we're looking at.
Thank you, Mr. Fregnito. Are there any other questions? Chair Anderson, did you have a few?
I do.
Oh,
Just a quick one.
Representative Detmer, go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there any legal actions a PCA firm can take in this situation?
Mr. Fregnito.
Mr. Chair, Representative Detmer, I am not an attorney, so I'm not going to venture into the legal ramifications, but I know that the conversations are taking place.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Fregnito. Any follow-up? Anyone else? Chair Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On what Representative Vogel and Representative Detmer were talking about, and I realize that you maybe don't know it, maybe Mr. Nobles or Ms. Layson know this, or even our staff, Mr. Gehring. Do we have any capabilities to amend the state auditor's report so that there's at least a notation to refer to the OLA report, or what kind of communication do we have the capability to do so that when these, whether it's federal or other entities that are looking at these firms, they have a little bit of the context of what's going on? And I don't know, Mr. Fregnito or Mr. Gehring, I'm sure that this is probably new, so I don't know what our capabilities are.
Mr. Gehring, any response to that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, I guess I would need to think about that a little bit. We certainly could direct the state auditor to include a statement like that in future reports. I'm not sure about the status of this report since it's already been issued, if we could amend it.
Okay, Chair Anderson. Mr. Fregnito.
Mr. Chair and Representative Anderson, we have asked the state auditor to restate the report and provide the addendum to it, and to date have not seen it.
Okay.
Chair Anderson, any further?
The other thing too, it was mentioned by Representative Green, I think, that there's concerns that the state auditor's office has actively sought out federal agencies to say, hey, these firms you need to be watching out for. Have you gotten feedback from any of your members that has actually happened?
Mr. Fregnito.
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, not specifically where the state auditor has reached out to any federal agencies, but it's common that if a CPA firm is being reviewed in a state, that other states will look at it, and depending on the scope of the review, there may be a situation where when a firm is licensed in multiple states, when they renew their license in that state, they have to check a box that says, yes, we're being reviewed by another government entity. And so once that happens, then word travels and others start to pick up on it, and then another state or another agency may look at it and say, do we also need to review this firm? So you start to have a piling on effect based on what happens in one particular state.
Madam Chair?
And Mr. Chair and Mr. Fragnito, so that in your opinion, would you say that it is a competition disadvantage to law firm or CPA firms in Minnesota when they're seeking work outside of the state and are competing with outside of Minnesota CPA firms?
Mr. Fragnito?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, this report definitely has caused some competitive issues for the firms in Minnesota.
Madam Chair?
And Mr. Chair and Mr. Fragnito, what is the largest firm that you represent? How many people do they employ?
Mr. Fragnito?
Well, it is anywhere, in Minnesota, I would guess it's around 900, Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions with members here? Representative Omar?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Fragnito, the addendum that you're referring to that should be added to the back of the report, was there a public request for that the addendum to be added?
Mr. Fragnito?
Mr. Chair, Representative, the Minnesota Society of CPAs did send a letter to the Office of the State Auditor, and it included in it a number of points, one of which was our belief that the report should be amended to reflect the ongoing conversations that took place and the clarifications that were provided by the CPA firms.
Representative Omar, do you have a follow-up?
Chair, yeah, can you share that letter with us?
I can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fragnito. Any other questions? All right, the chair would like to call down Mary O'Connor from Brooklyn Center. I believe you have some testimony for us. Thank you for coming to the state capitol. Please, yes, please state your name for the record and your position.
My name is Mary O'Connor, and I'm from Brooklyn Center. How can the appointed legislative auditor audit the elected state auditor? The state constitution says there will be a division of powers among the branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And according to the Constitution, auditing belongs in the executive branch. I'd also like to say that when you give state money to cities or counties, it should be audited by the state auditor, not by a CPA firm chosen by the city or county.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connor. I believe our staff here, Matt Gearing, could answer that question for you.
Mr. Chair, and to the testifier, so separation of powers principles do provide a separate constitutional office for auditing of local governments, and we have established in law the Legislative Auditor's Office, who is governed by the Legislative Coordinating Commission and provides auditing services for state agencies and other special reviews, as the auditor has described previously.
That's not
Ms.
an
O'Connor?
answer. That's not an answer. The Constitution says that there will be a division of powers, and it puts auditing in the executive branch. So how can you set up a legislative auditor?
Ms. O'Connor, I believe Chair Anderson might be able to help you a little bit, too.
Sure. So thanks for coming today, Ms. O'Connor. What we're going to do is we're going to have Mr. Gearing, he will cite the statute language for you. Hopefully we can get the page to give you a copy of it so you can see where that gives us the authority to do it. Mr. Nobles, if you want to add to that as well. But then I think your other question was that you wanted to know about the auditing about the cities and counties. We actually, the state auditor does not audit any of the cities except for Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. All the other cities in the state of Minnesota are not audited by the state auditor. They are audited by private CPA firms. The same applies to all of our school districts too. So cities, except for the three I named, and the school districts are not audited by the state auditor. So Mr. Nobles, if you can come forward and maybe add the legislative authority piece to that, I think that would be helpful.
Mr. Knowles, pleasure to see you again.
Yes, thank you. It's here sooner than I thought. Mr. Chair, members, as I mentioned before, the legislature decided to take the audit function out of the executive branch in 1973. And the reason they did that is because one of the cardinal principles of any audit is independence, whether it's done by a CPA firm or a public audit organization. And the public examiner was simply determined to be not independent because he was appointed by the governor and was auditing the executive branch which is obviously under the jurisdiction of the governor. I would also say that over half of the states, to the best of my knowledge, and maybe more now, have a similar arrangement as Minnesota, and that is the audit function is in the legislative branch. That is also, of course, the case in the U.S. Federal government. The Government Accountability Office is a watchdog office of the Congress. And so I think it is a well-established principle that post-auditing is a legislative function. It is, in fact, a responsibility of the legislative branch to determine that expenditures made with public funds made by state agencies are compliant with the laws that are enacted. And I might just correct the idea that when the Constitution was established in Minnesota, that the state auditor, who is named in the Constitution, but given no functions, that the state auditor was in fact not a post auditor. The state auditor served as a comptroller, was a co-signer of warrants for all of the time from the beginning of the Constitution until the transfer of responsibility in 1973. So the fact is that the state auditor was not a post auditor as envisioned by the constitutional framers, but a comptroller within the executive branch that would approve expenditures before they were made. I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful, Mr. Nobles. Thank you so much. Mr. Gearing, have you had a chance to look up the statutes?
Mr. Chair, I think what I could maybe do is speak with the testifier after the hearing's over, but I would just point out that in Chapter 6, we provide in law that the state auditor shall superintend and manage the fiscal concerns of the state as required by law, and so the legislature would enact the laws that provide the powers of that office, and it's the state constitution that establishes the office of the state auditor, but does not specify the specific duties except as provided by law.
Mr. Chair?
Ms. O'Connor, one further question. Go ahead.
It says that the legislature shall give the duties to the state auditor, but instead it's given auditing duties to the legislative auditor. So if it's got some auditing duties it wants done, they should go to the state auditor, not to a made-up legislative auditor.
Okay. Ms. O'Connor, thank you very much for coming. Maybe you want to offline talk to Mr. Gearing here and Mr. Nobles. We appreciate your interest on this a great deal, and it gets a little complicated, but I'm sure they can clear that up for you. Are there any other questions for members? Any other business? Seeing none, meeting's adjourned.